Do you make a distinction between grains such as quinoa, millet, amaranth, teff, buckwheat, wild rice that are non-glutinous grains compared with grains such as wheat, oats, and barley? Do you make a distinction when we use the word whole grains between quinoa, millet, amaranth, teff, buckwheat, and wild rice, which are non-glutinous, versus grains that do have gluten like wheat, oats, and barley?
So we use non-glutinous grains. We don't use wheat, rye, or barley routinely with anybody, just because we find a high percentage of people, even if they don't have celiac disease or frank allergies, do better. And most of those high gluten grains are typically served as flour products or highly processed food products, which we also avoid. So we use a wide variety of grains, all of the ones you've mentioned, including things like wild rice, other types of formats, but we found it better to avoid the high gluten grains in any form.
My concern is that most of the wild rice grown in this country is commercially grown wild rice. It's not wildly grown wild rice. And therefore, there's still too much arsenic contamination in commercially grown wild rice, where the other grains are more favorable because they don't suck up arsenic as much as the rice does, even wild rice. Now, you can buy wildly grown wild rice that's harvested by by like Native Americans who knock it down in the marshes in their canoes, where they're not commercially grown, and these are much safer sources of whole grains. So yes, so the concern, and I noticed you didn't mention, was regular brown rice, and that's our concern today because the brown rice paddies grown on cotton fields and areas where they're using chicken manure that have been contaminated, and because brown rice takes up too much arsenic compared to other grains, we're kind of more recently avoiding more rice and using those other grains like colorful quinoa and some of the other grains mentioned as the source of whole grain and intact grain. And as Alan said, trying more and more not to grind them into flour, but to eat them in their intact form, cooked with water, to minimize their glycemic effect.
I'm clearly trying to kill myself, and I have a death wish for all the people we're helping too, because we even allow, I hope you are all sitting down, yes? Some of our people eat bread, okay? I mean, and so again, we're not restricting gluten-containing foods unless people have celiac disease or inflammatory bowel disease. Certain autoimmune patients shouldn't have it. But we're trying to get people to do this in a community setting for a long period of time. And so we're not restricting those grains, and we even allow some processed food. Again, the key is showing people a diagram so they can see clearly if they're eating according to plan. And people eat bread all over the world. Some of the longest lived people on the planet eat bread. Not everybody should eat bread, and not everybody should eat processed foods. Again, looking at differences in populations that we're serving. But because we're serving a more general population that isn't as sick and as motivated, and we're trying to get them to do it for a long period of time, we're not restricting grains unnecessarily, and we're not even restricting processed grains in that you can't have them. But when the processed food is higher intake than the whole foods at the bottom of our pyramid, then people know that they have to make a change.